first I'm going to start with probably the biggest issue. It seems like if you ask anybody on the street in California, up and down the state, affordable housing and homelessness, they're both tied together.
That's right.
What's your plan, first of all, to make sure people can live within a reasonable distance of their job?
No, I mean, look, we're 49th out of 50th in per capita housing units. We have an affordability crisis in the state of California. And I don't use that word often because I think we tend to dilute its meaning. It is a crisis. We're losing our middle class. It is the bubble word. I've been out on this campaign trail for 2 years, town halls all across this state. It's not just a coastal issue in dense urban environments and high cost parts of the state. It's a big issue in rural parts of this state. And so it unites everyone in terms of the anxiety and stress, kids that are still living with parents at 30, 35 years old, and the parents fearing that if the kids move, they may move out of the state. And so we have to get serious about building more housing. It's a production issue. Fundamentally, we got to preserve existing housing stock, which goes deep into the issue of rapid rehousing, particularly as it relates to homelessness. And the difference between myself, respectfully, and my opponent is we've laid out a detailed, comprehensive strategy to address the homeless crisis and to address the housing crisis. And we've laid out prescriptive, measurable opportunities to actually make a real impact in real time if we're successful.
So give us one thing from your specific plan on making more affordable housing.
On the affordable housing side, it's not very complicated. We need to increase our affordable housing tax credit from $85 million to $500 million. We want to bring back successor agencies to redevelopment and more enhanced infrastructure financing. Forgive me for being wonky on this, but it is a legitimate issue. You have to be wonkish about it. You have to know how to pull the levers. It's not just about getting rid of regulations. It's more complicated than that. We certainly want to streamline the regulatory process, but moreover than anything else, we will have stated goals, 3.5 million housing units. We want to make sure that local government is incentivized, which means we want to match grant funding, and we also want to disincentivize local government that is not meeting its housing goals by taking transit dollars and sending those transit dollars to those municipalities and those communities that are meeting their goals. So incentives, disincentives, specific plans, matching grants, new goals, and much more intentionality around this issue of bringing people together regionally and locally with the state officials to set forth a much more aggressive course.
Your opponent talked about the cost of building is too high in California. Would you agree?
The cost of building is very high in California. That's a nice thing to identify as an issue. The question is, what is he specifically proposing to address it? We're proposing focusing on materials, modular housing, prefab housing, novel strategy, all part of our plan and proposal. I've not heard those details, any details whatsoever, except reducing regulation. He wants to eliminate, he said, CEQA, our environmental regulations. Just eliminate them. I hope people understand what that may ultimately mean and pause and express some caution and concern about that extreme position that he's advancing.
What does that mean to us?
Well, it basically means that anyone can run roughshod over any development without any consideration of its consequences, intended or otherwise. That's what CEQA was conceived by the Reagan administration many, many moons ago, protects. There are abuses with CEQA. We have to address those abuses, more categorical exemptions, as I'm calling for socially desirable projects, more programmatic environmental reviews, what we call EIRs. We've laid those out as specific details, but as he suggests, eliminating CEQA, I think, would be devastating to the state's economy, not just its environment.
I've always thought about, what about requiring in the permitting process that a certain amount of any construction is for affordable housing?
Well, no one does that more than San Francisco. We have some of the highest inclusionary, what we call inclusionary set-asides for affordable housing in the state. The problem is not every municipality can afford to do that. The market values of some of the units here in San Francisco afford the city, San Francisco, to do that, where other parts of the state not necessarily enjoying those kinds of market rates. That said, I do believe in affordable housing set-asides. I do believe in incentivizing middle income housing, which is a major issue that's not talked and discussed enough. That's where jobs go to sleep. Workforce housing, middle class housing. And one of the proposals we are offering, and one of the things that I will pursue if we're successful in this race, is engaging the private sector, particularly some of the largest tech companies in this region and in this state, to address our twin challenge, and that is affordability for their workforce, and look to take some of this repatriated money that came from that Trump tax bill, the hundreds of billions of dollars that have come back to this country, tens of billions here in this state and in this region, and to look to build a collaborative to help finance what we call that missing middle. Those are housing units at 60 to 120% of AMI, area medium income. Again, forgive the wonkishness, but to focus on that missing middle as also a big part of our agenda to address the affordability crisis.
That includes teachers and police officers who can't live in their city where they're working.
That goes deep to that issue. And that's a huge issue as a former mayor of San Francisco, that we're literally landlocked. If you lose that one point of access, which is actual land access versus these bridge points of access, from an emergency preparedness perspective, getting your first responders back into the city is a profound and pronounced problem. So connecting these issues, jobs, housing linkages, and that housing and jobs linkage is a transportation question as well. All of these things are related. So our housing thrust is focusing on the interdependence between transit funding and housing production goals, and making sure the two are twinned, and making sure we support smart growth, density bonuses around transit corridors where most of the housing production can be addressed in a way that also provides for quality of life, livability, and a stronger environmental framework.
Also very much related is our homelessness. A lot of people living in these tent cities.
It's out of control. It's ever been worse. 134,000 in our last count. 24% of the nation's homeless in this state. It's a disgrace. It's unacceptable. It has gotten much, much worse than it has ever been in my lifetime. And we need a governor who gives a damn about this, that is going to be aggressive and hold folks accountable at a local level to do more and do better. Rapid rehousing. What I want to do is something called SSI advocacy to get folks on the federal appropriation, which will allow for more money being drawn from the federal government that will allow us additional resources to get people back in their housing. We've got to deal with the mental health crisis. Again, another crisis in the state that has not been addressed, and the substance abuse challenges, people self-medicating out on the streets and sidewalks in record numbers. We want an agency director on homelessness, which has not been the case in the past. We are going to convene local government in a way that no previous governor has in the past, and I have a lot of experience on this. We were able to reduce the street population by 40% when I was mayor. We were able to get 10,000 people off the street when I was mayor. We made real progress. There were challenges nonetheless, and I clearly didn't do enough, but I have a sense of what works and what doesn't work, and we have real strategies, real plans. We're not just demagoguing this issue, I'm not just identifying it. We're going to hit the ground running if we're successful starting in a transition, not waiting until January of next year.
Your opponent is talking about a place to get clean needles is not the answer. It's just continuing the problem.
No, just stepping over people on the streets and sidewalks is not working either. And so my belief is getting people access to treatment is a hopeful strategy to get people off the streets. What's not a hopeful strategy is denying the reality and offering nothing constructive in terms of how one addresses it. The fact is, people that are addicted to opioids, people are addicted to heroin, people are addicted to methamphetamine. They don't just wake up one morning and say, you know what, I'm just going to stop on my own. It's one of the most insidious addictions that exist. They need help. And the ability to connect folks with those addictions to professionals that are there to stabilize and help turn their lives around. Wow, why would we miss that opportunity to try to iterate and do something differently on this issue, as opposed to, again, demagogue it and offer quite literally nothing in terms of an alternative to the status quo.
And the Governor Brown signed this week, I believe yesterday, it sounded kind of like forcing people into, I mean, how do you get people in to get the help? You can't force them. You can't drag them in and keep them there.
No, there's a lot of studies on coerced treatment not being as effective. But I'm not ideological on this. I've seen coerced treatment programs, drug courts actually work. For some, not everybody. You got to meet people where they are. But the bottom line at the end of the day, as you can't deny, there's never been a drug-free society in human history. And so we have to address it from a harm reduction perspective. The Bay Area has led the nation, not just the state, in terms of those strategies. It was wildly controversial when we did needle exchange decades ago. But the rates of Hep C and HIV and AIDS significantly declined. Lives were saved, and taxpayers were saved billions and billions of dollars that otherwise would have been spent in emergency rooms and chronic care had we not had the courage to lead on that with emergency declarations every 2 weeks. And it's the same approach I want to take and lean into the reality that exists and persists all across this state. And that's called leadership. Again, a lot of folks just demagogue these issues, offer nothing in strategies and solutions. I've had the practical application of being a former mayor, seeing what works, what doesn't. I've had now 7.5 years as lieutenant governor, getting a sense of how Sacramento works. And I've studied these issues. I've dealt deep into the policy. I've got real ideas and plans and the best and the brightest folks that want to come work for us. We have a chance to do something big and bold. I just hope we have that opportunity by winning this damn election in November.
I have seen in reports that we've done, it seems that there are people who are kind of choosing to live in these tent city communities. They're forming these communities. I drive by it. They're under overpasses. It's dangerous. It's a health issue. It's a fire danger. I mean, how do we get those people who aren't necessarily dealing with mental health issues or drug addictions? They're living on the streets. How do we get them out in a safe place and not come right back?
So rarely was a Friday when I was mayor, quite literally. This is not a gross exaggeration. It's modest exaggeration, for full disclosure, where I wasn't walking the streets, reaching out to the homeless and the Tenderloin in San Francisco and south of Market. And the consequence of doing that over the course of quite literally years and years and years as a county supervisor and a former mayor is I now reject the notion that somehow people are service resistant. I don't accept this notion that people, quote unquote, fancifully choose to live out on the streets and sidewalks and submit themselves to the elements, to crime and violence, to all kinds of assault. I just don't believe that. I think it's in the absence of alternatives that people do that. I often find is the case, someone has a partner and we're only offering units for single adults, not for partners. I find often that someone has a dog, understandably, if they're living out in the streets and sidewalks, and the shelter we're providing doesn't provide for their pets. Or some people are not necessarily ready to be drug-free, and the shelters require, or the housing units require them to be sober and clean, but they're just not there yet. All of those things have informed me that there's a lot of mythology, that some people just fancifully prefer sleeping out in the elements under overpasses. So I'm not there. It may take 5 or 10, maybe 20, 30 interventions to finally meet someone where they are, but my experience is we can get folks off the street. Homelessness can be solved. I don't think it can be solved. I know it can be solved. I've seen it. Thousands and thousands of human beings are quite literally off the streets that had chronic mental illness, that were self-medicating with drug or alcohol addictions, that people never thought had any interest in getting off the streets. And they're testament to the notion that we can turn this around. It's a question of our commitment. It's a question of resolve. It's a question of choosing to do more and be better as a society. And I choose to believe we can do more and do better and not demagogue the issue, point blame, point fingers, and offer quite literally nothing as a way of a solution.
All right, switching gears. I've seen your ads. You say every baby should have good prenatal care, toddlers should go to preschool, we should have affordable college.
Yeah.
How do we pay for all
Well,
this?
that's the ideal. That's the goal. You know, when I was mayor, we had the chance to fully implement universal preschool. No one thought that could be done. We did in the middle of a recession. 2008, 9, people said you're cutting all these programs. Yet, at the same time, we were investing in preschool, fully implemented. We did universal health care in the middle of a recession. 2007, 8, 9, San Francisco became the first city and county in America with universal health care. People say, how can you pay it? We found ways to get it done. So you set goals, you set commitments, and you try to advance those goals and commitments regardless of the external conditions. It's decisions, not conditions, that determine our capacity to answer those questions. I'm committed to early childhood education, not interested in it. And I'm committed for one fundamental reason. We're as dumb as we want to be as a society. The number one predictor, or at least one of the top predictors of whether or not you'll end up in the criminal justice system, is the number of words you speak in kindergarten. I mean, you want to get serious about lowering corrections costs, police overtime. You want to get serious about the achievement gap for African Americans, Latinos, address the wealth gap and the disparities on income. Then begin at the beginning. 85% of the brain is formed by the time you're 3. The brain actually starts pruning neurons at 4 that weren't connected. It's not a government program to educate a mother to talk to their kid, to read to their kid, to sing to their kid, to count to their kid. It's around intention. So it's not about money as much as it is about resourcefulness. And so I'm trying to offer a novel approach to deal with these vexing issues, and that's why we're leading with that ad and not leading with an ad attacking my opponent, rather attacking problems.
All right, leads right into schools. Your opponent is saying we're 46th, he threw out, in terms of schools in the states. We're actually, I looked up the recent polls, and we're more like 30th when it comes to achievement. Still not great.
Yeah, not satisfied. I mean, but a new report came out last week saying what we've been saying for the last couple of years on this campaign trail. The achievement gap doesn't manifest after you get out of high school and go into college. It manifests before you enter to kindergarten. I'll repeat that. The achievement gap exists before you start kindergarten in California. You want to get serious about education reform, you can triage, you can spend enormous amount of money on remediation, or you can address the root cause of the disparities and those stats. And that is we're not preparing our kids to enter into kindergarten. California is near the bottom. Oklahoma provides universal preschool. California does not. Overwhelming majority of Floridians have universal preschool. California doesn't offer it. We don't do enough on prenatal care, early Head Start, focusing on infant toddler care, and preschool. That is the top priority for me to address this issue of those disparities and address the issues that we struggle with as it relates to our educational outcomes in the state.
Charter schools?
I have in fact, opened a charter school in Bayview Hunters Point when I was mayor. I support high quality nonprofit charters that have transparency and accountability. I love best practices. I like competition, but not to create a competitive environment where we're at each other's throat, but to create competitive ideas that can be spread. And my biggest frustration with the charter movement right now is we're not spreading best practices of those outstanding charters or even those outstanding public schools like Lowell and Lincoln, Washington, in my own hometown in San Francisco. That's a big job, I think, of the next superintendent of public education and the next governor to begin to express a narrative of collaboration and cooperation, not this zero-sum game that is currently part of the debate around educational reformers versus quote-unquote establishment.
Your opponent has some very strong opinions about water in California, criticized the fact that we let the Oroville Dam get to the state that it was in. We've enacted a water rationing bill, which he doesn't necessarily agree with.
Yeah, once again, I don't know what he's offering besides rhetoric in terms of addressing those issues, but I'm proud of our governor and the legislature, what they did offer. And that was a $7.5 billion bond that they put on the ballot, and the public overwhelmingly approved it. $2.7 billion is set aside for above ground storage and larger storage capacity, which likely will occur near Colusa County, where Governor Brown's going to retire as Sites Dam. There are hundreds of millions of dollars for safe drinking water, water recycling, groundwater replenishment, innovation programs on technology. We're pursuing new desal plants in the state. My opponent has offered nothing the way of advice, counsel, or support for those efforts. And so we're moving in a different direction. There's some extraordinary toilet to tap strategies in Orange County. There's a lot of regional programs that are models not just for this state, but for the nation. And I feel like we've made a lot of progress over the last few years. I wish that progress had been made before Governor Brown took the oath of office, but we're in a much better place than we were prior. And moving forward, we have even more ideas and plans, particularly as it relates to those 400 water agencies that represent 90% of users. It's not a top-down solution. It's a bottom-up solution. It's regions rising together to address water issues, more recycling, more groundwater replenishment, stormwater capture, all part of a larger narrative that has been developed over the course of the last few years.
All right, the high-speed rail, is it on track or a train to nowhere?
It's not a train to nowhere. Anyone who suggests that is being really dismissive to the people in the Central Valley. In fact, not only dismissive, it's a ludicrous thing to say it's a train to nowhere. It demeans one of the fastest and most dynamic growing parts of the state, the Central Valley. There's extraordinary things happening in the Central Valley. For those of us living out on the coast, it's not just an agricultural issue. I mean, there's dynamism. You go to Fresno, a lot of young tech leaders out there and these startups and incubators. There's a lot of wonderful things happening. The opportunity to connect Central Valley to one of the most dynamic and innovative parts on the planet, Silicon Valley, is really the opportunity that presents itself with the high-speed rail now that we've reconstituted. I was very critical of the original business plan. It had gone way off the rails. They're now bringing it back, and they've reprioritized the phasing, valley to valley. And we can achieve that. And if we can achieve that first phase, then I think we can invite the private sector money to finish the job, and that's to get it over the Tehachapi Mountains, San Gabriel Mountains, down into Southern California.
And the criticism has been, why didn't it go along 5, where the infrastructure's there, the overpasses are there, you wouldn't have the environmental concerns?
Everybody has, I mean, that's one of a dozen critiques. There's other critiques that we stipulated that it has to be 220 miles per hour. You look at the TJV in France, you look at the Osaka lines in Japan, they actually operate much slower rates. And that matters from a cost perspective when you have to have that statutorily in the initiative, that $9.95 billion bond. It's just one of many issues. If you had a do-over, you'd make some adjustments. The reality is billions of dollars have been committed. $3.5 billion would have to be given back to the Trump administration if we decided to kill this project. We'd be involved in lawsuits and litigations for decades. We'd be out of pocket the billions we've already spent. There's thousands of construction jobs currently underway on this project. It is underway. We do have a rational new plan for phasing, which we can finance. I'd hate to see someone come in, like my opponent, and literally throw billions of dollars away and offer, again, nothing except rhetoric in the way of offering any alternative solutions to the legitimate crisis that exists in transportation in the state. Of course, that's not surprising considering he's opposing the investment of over $5 billion in our roads and bridges for public safety purposes as his top priority as a candidate for governor. And again, offering nothing in terms of how he would then finance the money he's taking away that simply doesn't exist.
He did tell me he feels there's a lot of waste in California. We spend 2 times as much as Texas on roads, 3 times as much as Nevada on prisoners, $6 billion in OT for state employees.
Good. And what is the specific plans to address that? I'm honest about that. I just don't know what it is. I love that. I've heard this, a golden oldie. It goes back quite literally a century. I'll get rid of waste and duplication. We're going to cut regulation and taxes, and everything's going to be wonderful. Well, I hope people take a look at that at scale. Kansas is the state that had the opportunity to promote those values. They're still struggling to catch up, even in this extraordinary macroeconomic recovery.
So you feel it's not waste? We're not wasting money?
Well, of course there's waste. I legendarily, as mayor, was fighting to get rid of waste and duplication and made tough calls. But there's not $50 billion of discretionary money in waste. I mean, what he's offering, let's put it in perspective. I mean, let's just deal with facts. $5 billion, $5.2 billion, he would have to literally reduce the size of the prison population by 67,000 inmates. I imagine he may think twice about promoting that. He might have to eliminate 1/2 of all elementary school teachers to find $5 billion. Perhaps he would have to eliminate every single person that works for Caltrans almost twice. Slightly exaggerated, it's about $2.86 billion payroll, but almost twice to find efficiencies. It's nonsense. He's just making stuff up. I don't mean that to indict him, but I am indicting the philosophy that sort of is enthralled by that rhetoric, which matches nothing in terms of reality. It's just nonsense.
All right, what's your plan for the DMV?
Oh, I've actually wrote a book years ago highlighting my frustrations with the DMV, going back to the Wilson years, where they failed on a $50 million IT information technology upgrade. I said in my book that the DMV is on the leading and cutting edge of 1973. It's the retail interface for government, and I don't think there's a greater sense of urgency in terms of reform than the Department of Motor Vehicles. We don't need an audit to tell us what's wrong. Audit's fine. I support an audit, always have, for months. But it's hardly the solution. What's the solution is leadership. Getting a tech-savvy director of the DMV, making sure we hire the best and the brightest as it relates to the future of retail, to get people out of line and online, to digitize a lot of the efforts that are currently underway and move those things more aggressively forward. Only 20% of the transactions are around licenses. So I do not buy any of the rhetoric that was the reason the lines were so bad, because 80% of that can be done in novel strategies, novel approaches. So I'm fully committed to this. We're going to lean into this. It's about exercising good governance. It's about an entrepreneurial spirit. It's about accountability and responsibility. This is one of the reasons I'm running for governor. And I want to be in that position to actually pull the levers on this and improve the quality of access to these essential documents in our lives at the Department of Motor Vehicles, but I want to decentralize that experience and bring it into your pocket, quite literally, onto your smartphone.
Feinstein or De Leon?
Oh, Feinstein. Easy.
Because?
Because she's competent, she's capable, she's skilled, she's well respected, she is deliberative, she's tough, and I've seen her deliver for the people of the state, people of Bayview, Hunters Point, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of remediation money for the most vulnerable community in the Bay Area. Environmental justice warrior. She delivered on infrastructure, on funding for public safety. I've just seen her deliver, and she knows how government works at a level that few do. Why would we disrupt that? I just think that would be foolhardy. And I say that not as an indictment to her opponent, but given the choice, it's an easy one.
All right, your opponent says he knows what it's like to struggle, build a business, and on the flip side, you've led a charmed life. You don't know what it's like.
Yeah, and he just doesn't know what he's talking about, and he's not interested in finding out about my childhood and how I grew up with actually a single mom, and who was a teenager when she was pregnant with me and on her own raising two kids, 21, 22 years old. She came from nothing. She struggled all her life. That was my life's experience growing up, working paper route, working Jeff Hicks Construction, working multiple jobs, including janitorial work in many of the buildings here in downtown San Francisco. And to the extent I was able to take pen and paper and organize to open my first business, not a family business, not a business someone else called me to say, hey, you want to work in here? Took an idea, wrote a business plan, got 13 investors, and was able to make that one business with one part-time employee, Pat Kelly, grow to 22 businesses, over 800 employees, is something I'm very proud of.
That sounds like this might be the answer to this question, but what is the biggest misconception about you, do you think?
I don't know. There's a lot of narratives, and that's drawn from the interaction that is San Francisco politics. It's not for the sheepish, not for there's an intensity to the engagement in local government, and narratives are developed, and it's hard to break them. But this notion that somehow I was born into another family and not my own family is something my sister and I often reflect on and say, my gosh, what an extraordinary picture that's been painted that absolutely is made up, but not surprising in the context of a political campaign.
So you've been in the public eye for quite some time, and it's not always pretty. Why do
No.
you want to be governor?
Because I don't think about that. I think about the things you can do. I think about solving the issues and the idealism I captured with the 60s and Sarge Shriver, solving the issues of ignorance and poverty and disease. I still believe I'm still an idealist. I'm still as well a pragmatist in terms of how we approach things from a non-ideological lens. I think we can solve the homeless crisis. I think we can address the affordability crisis. I think we can turn the education system around. I think we can lead this nation and the world in terms of advancing our values, not just resist Donald Trump, but be a positive alternative, not just on the environment, but immigration, healthcare policy, and on the issue that defines, for me, all other issues. That's the issue of work and how technology and globalization is radically changing the nature of work, not just the issues of automation, which are obvious around the corner, but the new work styles and new arrangements and not the commensurate benefits that come with that, and the insecurity and anxiety of people working 2-3 jobs, and TaskRabbit, Postmates, and Uber and Lyft are feeling. I just think we can solve those things, and no greater state to do it than California. And so I honestly never been more optimistic, despite everything in Washington, D.C. and the stress around the Supreme Court conversation. This is California. Well, it's no more magical place on earth. And for those that want to just focus on what's wrong with it, like my opponent, I don't know, forgive me, I'm paraphrasing Bill Clinton, but there's nothing wrong with this state that can't be fixed by tenfold by what's right with this state. And that's why I'm running for governor.